The wind on the high plains of Wyoming never truly slept. In the year of our Lord 1887, it was a restless, sighing thing that carried the scent of dust and distance. It swept across the withered grass of Half Moon Ranch, a sound like a lonely whisper that Silas Ward had long ago stopped trying to ignore. He had learned to live with it, the same way he had learned to live with the silence in his cabin and the ache in his bones. The land was his only companion, and it was a harsh one. The creek that bisected his property had dwindled to a muddy thread, its stones exposed to the sun like the bleached ribs of some long-dead animal. Red dust, fine as flour, coated everything: the warped boards of the barn, the leaves of the struggling cottonwood by the cabin, the very air he breathed. When it settled after a gust, the world seemed to hold its breath under a film of rust. From his porch, Silas could see the long, empty ribbon of the main road. Miles in the distance, it led to the town of Sweetwater, a place he visited only when necessity forced his hand. He could picture it clearly without looking: the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur of voices from the saloon, the stark wooden face of the post office. They were pieces of a world he no longer belonged to. His world was here, within the splintered rails of his fences, a kingdom of solitude with a population of one man, a handful of dairy cows, and a dog whose muzzle had gone gray with the years. Old Rook, the dog, lay at his feet, tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm against the porch boards. He was a good dog, quiet and undemanding, much like his master. Silas ran a calloused hand over the dog's head, the gesture stiff, almost mechanical. It had been 20 years since he had willingly touched another human being. 20 years since Sarah. His days were measured not by a clock, but by the sun and the needs of his animals. Before the first hint of light painted the eastern sky, he would be in the barn. The air inside was thick with the warm, animal smell of hay and manure. His cows, patient and heavy with milk, would turn their heads as he approached, their large, dark eyes watching him with a placid indifference he sometimes envied. He worked with a grim efficiency, his movements economical and precise. The rhythmic squirt of milk into the zinc bucket was one of the few sounds that broke the morning stillness. Milking, mending fences, chopping wood, cleaning his rifle. The tasks were a liturgy, a way to fill the hours and keep the memories at bay. He never went to the town market, sending his milk with a freight driver who knew not to expect conversation. He never shook a man's hand. At night, he slept on a narrow cot, his old cavalry revolver lying on the blankets across his chest, a cold and heavy comfort. He had been a different man once, a cavalryman with a future in his eyes and Sarah's hand in his. They had bought this piece of land together, dreaming of a life carved from the wilderness. They had called it Half Moon Ranch because they were two halves of a whole, but the West gave and the West took with equal, terrifying force. A sudden storm, a flash flood that turned the dry creek into a raging torrent, and the stampede, a neighbor's herd, panicked by the thunder and the rising water, had swept through their small valley. He could still hear it in his worst dreams, the thunder of 1,000 hooves, a sound that shook the very earth, and Sarah's scream. Swallowed by the chaos, he had found her afterward, in the mud and the ruin, a broken doll left behind by a careless giant. The guilt was a brand on his soul. He should have been faster. He should have built the storm shelter stronger. He should have shielded her, taken the blow himself. He should have done anything but survive her. So he had built a fortress of solitude around that memory, a fence of silence and routine to keep the world out, and the pain in. Sometimes a flicker of the old Silas would surface, a dry, bitter humor that he shared only with his animals. "You see, Bessie," he'd mutter to his best milker, a Guernsey with a perpetually unimpressed expression. "The difference between you and people is that I know what you want. A bit of fresh hay, a clean stall. People, they want a piece of your soul." The cow would just blink, chewing her cud, offering no argument. And for a moment, the crushing weight on his chest would feel a fraction lighter. They were difficult, his cows, but their needs were honest. Lately, however, their simple honesty had been complicated by something he could not quite name. There was a tension in the barn he hadn't felt before. Bessie and the others were restless. Their milk came slower, sometimes not at all, and their udders felt hot and tight beneath his hands. They flinched at his touch, their hides twitching. It was as if his own long-held tension, his inability to offer a gentle hand, was flowing from him into them. He was clumsy with them, his touch too rough, his voice too low and gravelly from disuse. He knew how to command, how to discipline, how to sight down the barrel of a gun, but he had forgotten the language of care, the soft words and soothing strokes that coax life into yielding its bounty. He was a soldier trying to be a farmer, and his herd was suffering for it. The pressure wasn't just in the barn. It was coming from Sweetwater, carried on the wind like the dust. A letter from the bank sat on his small kitchen table, its polite but firm language a constant, nagging reminder of the loan coming due. He had been a reliable customer for years. His milk contract with the town creamery, the one thread still connecting him to the world of commerce. But whispers had reached him that the quality of his milk was slipping, and with that news, the shadow of Ephraim Cade loomed larger. Cade owned the vast ranch to the north, a cattle empire built on ambition and ruthlessness. He had made no secret of his desire to swallow Half Moon Ranch, to add its precious water rights to his own holdings. Cade saw Silas not as a neighbor, but as an obstacle, a stubborn old fool clinging to a past that should have been buried long ago. More than once, Silas had spotted one of Cade's men, a surly character named Buck Tolliver, lingering near his property line, his gaze lingering a little too long on the barn and the house. Tolliver had the look of a man who enjoyed trouble, and Silas knew his presence was not a coincidence. It was a message, a silent threat. Loneliness had been his shield for 2 decades, but now it felt like a cage. The work was becoming too much for one man. The fences sagged in places he hadn't yet reached. The well pump handle was loose, and now the cows were failing him, or he was failing them. To admit he needed help was to admit that his fortress was crumbling, that the life he had built to honor Sarah's memory was unsustainable. It was a failure he could not bear. Care, he was learning, was not a matter of discipline alone. It could not be managed with a gun and a strong will. It required something more, something he had locked away so long ago he wasn't sure he could find it again. This morning, as he walked the fence line, checking for breaks from the previous night's wind, he saw it. Snagged on a barb of the wire near the front gate was a small scrap of cloth. It was a simple piece of calico, faded blue with a pattern of tiny white flowers. It wasn't his. It wasn't from any gear he owned. The wind could have carried it from miles away, a random bit of refuse from a passing wagon. But the way it was caught, twisted tightly around the wire as if a hesitant hand had clutched the fence right there, suggested something else. It looked like someone had stood there, just outside his gate, perhaps for a long time, looking in. The image was unsettling. It was a sign that the world he had tried so hard to keep at bay was standing at his doorstep, waiting. Old Rook trotted to the gate, sniffing the air, and let out a low, questioning whine. Silas stared at the small blue flag of fabric, flapping in the relentless Wyoming wind. It was a question, and he had no answer. The dust of the road was a living thing, stirred into a fine haze by the morning sun. It clung to the boots of the girl walking toward Half Moon Ranch, turning the worn leather a pale, ghostly brown. Silas saw her from the porch, a solitary figure moving with a steady, determined gait that spoke of a long walk and a clear purpose. He had been about to head back to the barn, a small pail of milk for his own coffee swinging from his hand. But he stopped, his body going still. Visitors were a rarity, an unwelcome disruption to the carefully constructed peace of his days. Old Rook, sensing his master's tension, rose from the porch boards and let out a low growl. the fur on his neck standing stiff. Silas placed a hand on the dog's head, a silent command to be still. As she drew closer, he could make out the details. She was young, no more than 19, with a cascade of auburn hair pulled back from a face that was serious and smudged with dust. She carried a new-looking zinc bucket, the handle gripped tight in one hand. She did not falter as she approached the gate, her eyes fixed on him, direct and unnervingly clear. She stopped just outside the fence line, the very spot where he had found the scrap of calico fabric. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried on the dry air, steady and without tremble. "Folks in town have a saying about you, Mr. Ward." Silas said nothing. He remained on the porch, a silent statue of a man, waiting. A small, wry smile touched her lips, a fleeting expression that acknowledged the absurdity of her own words. They say he hadn't touched a woman in 20 years until a girl grabbed a bucket and asked to milk his cows. The words hung in the air between them, a strange and audacious challenge. It was the town's gossip, the whispered story of the reclusive old soldier, thrown back at him like a stone. He felt a muscle jump in his jaw. It was a crude attempt to disarm him, to use the legend of his isolation as a bridge instead of a wall. He should have been angry, should have ordered her off his land for her impudence. Instead, he found himself momentarily speechless, caught off guard by the sheer nerve of it. "I need work," she said, her tone shifting from wry humor to simple, unadorned fact. "My name is Abigail Quinn. My father is the blacksmith in Sweetwater, or he was, until the consumption took hold of his lungs." The words came out plain, without a plea for pity. "My mother is worn out from nursing him and looking after the 3 little ones. The medicine from the doctor costs more than we have, and we are running out of time." She gestured with the bucket. "I heard you keep dairy cows. I grew up on a farm outside of Boston. I know how to handle a herd. I'm a hard worker, and I'm not afraid of the dirt." He watched her, his mind struggling to process the intrusion. A blacksmith with consumption. He knew the sound, a hollow, rattling cough that seemed to steal a man's strength with every breath. He knew the look of exhaustion on a woman's face when she was fighting a losing battle. He had seen too much of it in the war, and in the hard years that followed. Her story had the ring of truth, as solid and unyielding as the land itself. He finally moved, walking down the porch steps and toward her, the small pail of milk still in his hand. He stopped a few feet from the gate, his silence a palpable barrier. "I manage on my own," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I can see that," she replied, and her gaze flickered for a second to the sagging line of fence that ran toward the creek, to the splintered timber of the small bridge that had been damaged in the last spring thaw. Her eyes missed nothing. He felt a prickle of irritation. This girl, with her Boston past and her desperate honesty, was seeing the cracks in his fortress, the places where his solitude was failing him. "I'm here about the job," she said, as if there were a job to be had, as if this were a normal transaction. "To milk your cows." He was about to refuse again, to send her on her way with a firm and final no, when she added something that stopped him cold. "I was speaking with Mrs. Dobbs at the creamery yesterday," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "She mentioned she was worried for you, said the last few deliveries of your milk have seemed thin, watery. She was afraid your cows were falling ill." The word struck a nerve deeper than her mention of town gossip. It was one thing for the town to whisper about his loneliness. It was another for them to question his livelihood, the quality of his work. It was a matter of pride. He knew the milk had been poor. He knew the cows were agitated. But to hear it from this stranger, to know it was being discussed in town, was a fresh humiliation. It gave weight to the bank's letter, to the shadow of Ephraim Cade. Sabotage. The thought flickered in his mind. Unwelcome and ugly. Had Buck Tolliver been doing more than just watching? He walked to the gate and unlatched it, the screech of the rusty hinge loud in the quiet morning. He stepped through, his eyes never leaving hers. "My cows are fine," he said, the words a low growl. She held out the zinc bucket. "Then let me prove it." As he reached for the bucket, his rough, calloused fingers brushed against hers. A jolt, sharp and electric as a lightning strike, shot up his arm. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact. But for Silas, it was a violation. 20 years of guarded stillness were shattered in that single, brief touch. He recoiled as if he had touched a hot stove, his hand flying back to his side. The sudden movement made him slosh the pail in his other hand, and a splash of white milk spilled over the rim, splattering onto the toe of his worn leather boot. He stared at the white drops, a profound sense of shock washing over him. The stain on his boot was a mark of his weakness, a visible sign of the wound he had carried for 2 decades. He had forgotten what it felt like, the simple warmth of another person's skin. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and a cold dread washed over him. Abigail Quinn saw it all. She saw the flinch, the spilled milk, the raw panic in his eyes. But she did not comment on it. She did not look away in embarrassment or pity. Her gaze remained steady, and in her eyes he saw not judgment, but a quiet, startling understanding. She simply held the bucket a little further out, waiting for him to take it. The social impropriety of the situation was not lost on him. He knew what the women of the town would say. A young, unmarried girl, coming out to the ranch of a man like him, a recluse, a widower. They would call her foolish, or worse. The preacher would deliver a sermon on the wages of sin and the importance of a woman's reputation. For her to be here was to defy all of that, to risk her good name for the chance of a job. It spoke of a desperation that was deeper than he could fathom. "I can manage," he repeated, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. He looked around his own ranch, at the evidence of his solitary struggle, the broken bridge, the failing cows, the letter from the bank. Everything around him was a testament to the lie he was telling. Abigail's voice was gentle, but her words were sharp as a freshly honed blade. "You don't need the help, Mr. Ward. That's true," she said softly. "But your cows do." It was the perfect strike. It bypassed his personal pride and hit the heart of his identity as a rancher. He had taken on this land, these animals. They were his responsibility, and he was failing them. To deny that would be to deny the evidence of his own hands, the hot, tight udders of his herd, the thinness of the milk in the pail. He was trapped. His instincts, honed by 20 years of solitude, screamed at him to send her away, to retreat back into the safety of his silent world. But the reality of his situation, the quiet logic in her eyes, held him fast. Seeing his hesitation, she pressed her advantage, offering him a way out that still allowed him to keep a sliver of his pride. "Let me make you a proposal," she said. "Let me work for 1 week, no pay. I will milk the cows, tend to them my way. If, at the end of that week, their milk is not richer and they are not calmer, then I will walk back to Sweetwater and you will never see me again. You will have lost nothing but a few days of my time." It was an offer he could not reasonably refuse. It was a challenge to his own methods, a gamble she was willing to take. He looked from her earnest, dust-streaked face to the barn where his troubled herd stood waiting. He thought of Sarah, of the promise he had made to make this land flourish. He was breaking that promise, letting it wither and die along with his own heart. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sighing of the wind and the distant caw of a crow. Old Rook, who had been watching the exchange with a quiet intensity, walked over to the girl and sniffed at her outstretched hand. After a moment, his tail gave a single, tentative wag. Silas let out a slow breath, a sound of resignation, of a battle lost, or perhaps of a different battle just beginning. He reached out, his hand deliberately avoiding hers this time, and took the zinc bucket by its handle. He gave a short, grudging nod, a barely perceptible motion, but it was enough. The first rail in his fence had been broken. The fortress had been breached. They fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the herd. It was a silent, carefully choreographed dance of two people occupying the same small space, each pretending the other was merely a feature of the landscape. Abigail would arrive while the stars were still sharp against the black sky, her lantern a small, swinging moon bobbing along the dark road from town. She would go straight to the barn, her movements quiet and purposeful. Silas, already awake for an hour, would watch her approach from the darkness of his cabin window before turning to his own chores. He took on the tasks that kept him at a distance, repairing the broken bridge over the dry creek bed, digging out a section of the well that had begun to silt up, and making the twice-weekly wagon run into Sweetwater to deliver the milk and pick up supplies. He never offered her a ride. She never asked. This was their unspoken agreement, a treaty of safe distance. They communicated through actions rather than words. He would leave a bucket of fresh, cool water on a bench outside the barn for her to wash with. She, in turn, would leave the milking stools and brushes cleaned and set back in their precise places, a small gesture of order that his soldier's soul appreciated. On the third morning, the dance changed. Silas was sharpening an axe blade on the grindstone near the barn when he heard Abigail's voice, soft but firm. Speaking to Bessie, it was unusual enough to make him pause, his foot still on the pedal. He had only ever heard her speak to him. He watched from the corner of his eye as she ran a hand along the cow's flank, her touch slow and methodical. Then she knelt, not with the milking pail, but to examine the cow's udder more closely. She spent a long time there, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she finally stood and walked toward him, he felt a familiar stiffening in his shoulders. She was crossing the invisible line they had drawn between their worlds. She stopped a respectful distance away, wiping her hands on a clean cloth. "Mr. Ward," she began, her voice even. "Bessie has the early signs of mastitis. So does the brown jersey. See the redness here?" She pointed toward the barn. "And their udders are too hot. That is why the milk is thin and why they have been so agitated. It pains them to be milked." He said nothing. His pride stung. He had been a fool, mistaking their discomfort for simple stubbornness. He had been fighting them instead of helping them. "It is not a serious case yet," she continued, sensing his defensiveness. "We can treat it back home. My father taught me to use a warm salt solution, to clean them thoroughly before and after each milking. It soothes the inflammation and helps prevent the infection from spreading." She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "It requires more time, and a gentle hand." The unspoken criticism hung in the air, a gentle hand. The very thing he lacked. He gave a curt nod, the only concession he could offer. "See to it," he rasped, and turned back to his axe, the screech of steel on the stone a harsh answer to the quiet competence that was slowly invading his solitude. From that day on, the barn became her domain. He watched her mix the warm salt water and carefully bathe each cow. He saw how she moved among them, her voice a low, soothing murmur, her hands always gentle, and he saw the change. Within days, the cows grew calmer. They no longer flinched at her approach, but would turn their heads and low softly. The milk began to flow easier, and when he looked into the pails before loading them onto the wagon, he could see the difference. It was whiter, richer, with a thick layer of cream rising to the top. The simple, undeniable proof of her skill was a constant, quiet rebuke to his own years of fumbling. One afternoon, a new sound drifted from the barn. It was a clear, lilting melody, a tune he had never heard before. It was Abigail, whistling as she worked. The song was bright and quick, full of unfamiliar twists and turns that spoke of a different world, a place with ships and cobblestones and salty air. The sound was so alien in the profound quiet of Half Moon Ranch that he stopped his work, head cocked, listening. It had been 20 years since music had graced this land. Sarah used to hum as she worked in her garden, simple folk tunes that the wind would carry to him in the fields. This was different. more complex, but it stirred the same ghost of a feeling, an ache of something beautiful that had been lost. A moment later, old Rook, who had been dozing in a patch of sun, lifted his head, his ears perked. He let out a low, mournful aroo, a long, drawn-out note that tried, and failed, to match the whistled tune. The dog tried again, and this time, Abigail's whistling broke into a soft laugh. Silas felt a strange lurch in his chest. He was an intruder in his own life, an observer of a scene of simple, easy joy that he had no part in. He turned away, a flush of awkwardness creeping up his neck, and went back to his work with a renewed, almost violent, energy. The following day, when he was in Sweetwater, Abigail took it upon herself to visit the creamery. Mrs. Dobbs, a stout woman with flour on her apron and a shrewd eye, greeted her with a warm smile. "Abigail, my dear, I was hoping I would see you," she said, wiping her hands. "The milk from Half Moon Ranch is like night and day, rich and sweet. Whatever you are doing out there, you have a magic touch." "It is the cows, not me," Abigail said modestly. "They were just in need of some proper attention. I was wondering, Mrs. Dobbs, who usually delivers the milk for Mr. Ward." Mrs. Dobbs pursed her lips. "Well, mostly he brings it himself, but on days he is mending fence or has other business, he sends it with the freight driver. Tom, why do you ask?" "Just curious," Abigail said, keeping her tone light. "Has anyone else ever been near the wagon when it is waiting to be unloaded? For instance," the older woman thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, that no-account Buck Tolliver has been sniffing around a few times. Cade's man, I saw him lingering by the wagon last week. When Tom was inside settling the account, I did not think anything of it at the time. Figured he was just loafing as usual." The piece of information clicked into place after her conversation with Mrs. Dobbs. Abigail began inspecting the large milk cans on the wagon herself each morning before Silas departed. Her suspicions were confirmed a day later. The lid on one of the rearmost cans was not seated as tightly as the others, and near the base of the can, clinging to a rivet, was a small smudge of dark, wet mud. It was not the dry red dust of the road. It was the thick, black mud from the edge of a stagnant pond, like the one that sat in the low-lying pasture on the far side of Silas's property, not far from the main road. The conclusion was as simple as it was ugly. Someone was waiting for the wagon, prying open a can, and adding a few scoops of dirty pond water, just enough to dilute the whole batch and spoil its reputation. The risk was enormous. If Mrs. Dobbs refused their contract, the bank would call in its loan without a second thought, and Ephraim Cade would be there, waiting to pick the bones. His fake sympathy a thin veil for his predatory glee. He was not just trying to buy the land. He was trying to steal it through sabotage and deceit. That evening, the air was heavy with the promise of a storm that never broke. After Abigail had finished the milking, Silas found himself hesitating at the door of his cabin. It was the end of the first week. Her trial period was over. By the terms of their agreement, she could walk away, her point proven. The thought of the barn falling silent again, of the cows growing tense under his clumsy hands, was a more hollow prospect than he cared to admit. He cleared his throat. "The sound, loud in the twilight?" "Coffee's on," he said, not looking at her. It was not an order, not quite an invitation. It was a simple statement of fact, left for her to interpret. She paused, then gave a small nod and walked to the porch. Sitting on the top step, he brought out 2 tin mugs of the hot, black liquid and handed one to her. This time, he was careful. Their hands did not touch. But as he sat on the old wooden chair a few feet away, the space between them felt charged, different. The safe distance had shrunk. They drank in silence for a while, watching the heat lightning flicker on the far horizon. "My father," she said suddenly, her voice soft. "He could take a bar of iron, heat it in the forge until it glowed like the sun, and bend it into a perfect horseshoe with just a few skilled blows. He was the strongest man I ever knew. She stared into her mug. Now, the sound of his breathing fills the whole house, a thin, whistling sound, like the wind through a keyhole. It takes all his strength just to sit up in bed. Silas looked at his own hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of hard labor and harder fighting. He remembered Sarah, how delicate she had seemed in the final days of a fever that had swept through the territory years before the stampede. He remembered the feeling of helplessness, of watching someone you would die for fade away, and there was nothing your own strength could do to stop it. He felt that old, familiar instinct rise in him, the fierce, useless urge to protect. He did not know what to say, so he said nothing. But in the shared silence, something shifted. It was an acknowledgement of a common wound, a shared understanding of loss that needed no words. When she finished her coffee, she stood to leave. "Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Ward." "Silas," he said, the name feeling strange on his own tongue. She smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "Silas." As she walked toward the gate, he stood up. "Abigail." She turned. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, iron key. He held it out to her. "This is for the feed and mineral store. You will know what the herd needs better than I do." She walked back and took the key from his outstretched palm. This time, their fingers did brush. A brief, warm contact. He did not pull away. He simply stood there as she closed her hand around the key. A silent transaction of trust that was worth more than a week's wages. It was an admission. He could not manage alone. And for the first time in 20 years, that thought did not feel like a defeat. It felt like a crack of light in a dark room. The sky had been acting strangely all afternoon, a canvas of bruised purples and sullen grays. By the time Abigail arrived for the evening milking, the air was thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. There was no wind, only an unnerving stillness, as if the world were holding its breath before a scream. In the west, the clouds were piled high, a mountain range of churning lead that swallowed the setting sun whole, plunging the prairie into a premature twilight. The cows knew. They were restless in their stalls, shifting their weight from hoof to hoof, their lowing edged with anxiety. A distant, low rumble, more a feeling in the chest than a sound, vibrated through the floorboards of the barn. Abigail worked with a focused calm, her movements deliberate and soothing. She knew that a spooked herd was a herd that held its milk, and held milk in this heat could quickly lead to a recurrence of the very inflammation she had worked so hard to heal. She spoke to them in a low, steady voice, her hands gentle as she washed and prepared them. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as she moved to the last cow, smacking against the dusty ground with a sound like pebbles being tossed on a drum. Then, with a sudden, violent roar, the heavens opened. The rain came down, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, hammering against the wooden roof of the barn until the sound was a deafening, continuous roll. A flash of lightning bleached the world white for a second, followed so closely by a crack of thunder that the very foundations of the building seemed to shudder. The cows bellowed in fear, their eyes wide and white in the dim lantern light. Silas appeared in the wide doorway, a silhouette against the maelstrom outside, his face grim. He had been securing the shutters on the cabin, and his shirt was already plastered to his skin. "This is no ordinary squall," he shouted over the din. "It is settling in for the night." Abigail nodded, her knuckles white as she gripped the milking stool to keep her balance against a sudden gust of wind that howled through the open door. She had to finish her work. She would not let a storm undo the progress they had made. She focused on the task at hand, the rhythmic pull and squeeze, a small point of order in the surrounding chaos. When she was finally done, the storm was a living entity, a wild beast of wind and water and percussive thunder. The 12-mile road back to Sweetwater was not just a road anymore. It was a dark, invisible track through a landscape that had become treacherous and alien. Flash floods could turn a dry gully into a deadly torrent in minutes, and the lightning was not a distant flicker but a series of brilliant, jagged spears plunging into the earth all around them. To attempt the walk now would be an act of utter foolishness, a gamble with a life she could not afford to lose. She stood by the barn door, staring out into the roaring blackness, the key to the feed store clutched in her hand. She felt a profound sense of being stranded, a tiny island in a vast, violent sea. Silas was there, standing a few feet away, watching the storm with the practiced eye of a man who knew the land and its furies. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken reality of her predicament. He was wrestling with something, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the rain-swept yard. The rigid rules of his solitude were colliding with a more fundamental, more human imperative. Finally, he turned to her, his expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. The words, when they came, were rough and clipped, as if torn from him against his will. "Stay in the barn tonight." It was not a question, it was a command, delivered in the brusque tone of a cavalry officer. Yet, beneath the gruffness, she heard the true meaning. It was an offer of sanctuary. It was his way of saying, "It is not safe, and I will not let you go." The words were a shield, meant to protect her not just from the storm, but from any hint of impropriety. The barn was neutral territory, a place of work, not a home. She felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made her knees buckle. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the roar of the wind. He gave a short, sharp nod, as if the matter were settled and required no further discussion. He disappeared for a few minutes, returning from the cabin with a pair of thick wool blankets and a canteen of water. He did not hand them to her directly. He laid them on a clean pile of hay in an empty corner stall, a space that was dry and far from the main door. "This will have to do," he said. Then he walked to the tack room, a small, windowless space at the back of the barn where he kept the harnesses and saddles. He took a third blanket from a storage chest and spread it on the floor for himself, just inside the doorway. He made a point of propping the door open with a small wooden wedge, a clear and deliberate gesture. It was a statement of honor, a tangible boundary drawn for her peace of mind and the preservation of her reputation. Should anyone ever ask, he would be a guardian at the gate. Nothing more. They sat for a long time in their separate spaces, the storm their only conversation. The thunder eventually moved off into the distance, its angry cracks softening into low, sleepy rumbles, but the rain remained, a steady, drumming rhythm on the roof, a sound like 1,000 gentle heartbeats. It washed the world clean and created a strange intimacy within the lantern-lit walls of the barn. In here, with the warm, sweet smell of hay and the soft sounds of the contented cows chewing their cud, the world felt small and safe. Silas finally broke the silence, his voice low and reflective in the quiet. "I am not used to the noise," he said, looking at the bridles hanging from wooden pegs on the wall. "The quiet, it gets inside you after a while, becomes a part of you." "Sometimes the quiet is the loudest sound of all," Abigail answered softly from her corner. He was silent for a moment. "Considering that you are not afraid," he stated. It was not a question. "Of the storm, of being here." "The storm will pass," she said simply, "and I have no reason to be afraid in here." He finally turned his head, his face half hidden in the shadows. A vulnerability she had never seen before flickered in his eyes. "It is I who am afraid," he confessed, the words so quiet she had to strain to hear them over the rain. "I am afraid to touch anyone. I feel like I am made of glass, like the slightest contact will shatter me." He was talking about what had happened at the gate, the spilled milk, the way he had recoiled from her. He was giving her the missing piece of the puzzle, the raw, painful truth of his isolation. Abigail considered his words, her heart aching for the depth of his loneliness. She thought of his rough hands, so clumsy with the cows, yet so capable of mending a broken fence or sharpening a blade to a perfect edge. She thought of the revolver he kept by his bed, a cold substitute for a warm hand. "You are wrong, Silas," she said, her voice gentle but firm. He looked up, surprised by her contradiction. "You are not afraid of people. You are afraid of losing them." The truth of her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was so simple, so precise. It lanced the wound he had protected for 20 years. He had built his fortress not to keep the world out, but to keep the pain of loss from ever getting in again, by not touching, by not connecting, by not loving. He could never again suffer the agony of having it all torn away. He had mistaken the prison for a sanctuary. He stared at her across the shadowy space, seeing not just a young woman seeking work, but a person with a wisdom that belied her years, a quiet strength that had somehow found its way through his defenses. She saw the turmoil in his eyes, the painful recognition. Without a word, she stood up and walked the few steps to the tack room doorway. He did not move, did not flinch, just watched her approach. She knelt in front of him, the lantern light catching the auburn strands in her hair. Then she reached across the small space and laid her hand on the back of his, where it rested on his knee. It was there for only a moment, a fleeting warmth against his rough skin. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a simple, profound act of human connection, an anchor in the storm of his past. He did not pull away. He simply sat there, rigid and still, feeling the warmth sink through his skin, down into the frozen core of him. It was a touch that did not demand or take, but only gave. A touch that said, "You are not made of glass. You are not broken. You are just a man." And for the first time in 2 decades, he felt a flicker of something other than grief. It was a fragile, unfamiliar sensation, but it felt like hope. Just as the feeling began to take root, the moment was shattered. Old Rook, who had been sleeping soundly at Silas's feet, suddenly shot up, a low, vicious growl rumbling deep in his chest. His ears were flat against his head, his eyes fixed on the main barn door. He let out a sharp, percussive bark, a sound of alarm that cut through the gentle drumming of the rain. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his soldier's instincts taking over. He moved to the doorway, peering into the dark, rain-swept yard. For a split second, a flicker of lightning illuminated the scene. He saw it then, a shape, a figure of a man, half crouched by the corner of the barn. The figure straightened, startled by the dog's bark, and then melted back into the torrential darkness. In the next heartbeat, there was nothing but the rain, the wind, and the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears. Someone had been out there, using the cover of the storm to sneak onto his land, and they had been watching. The morning after the storm, the world was scoured clean. The air, washed of its perpetual dust, was sharp and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and sage. Puddles the color of milky coffee stood in the ruts of the road, reflecting a sky of impossible blue. The violence of the night had given way to a fragile, profound peace. But as Silas loaded the fresh cans of milk onto the wagon, he knew the peace was an illusion. The figure he had seen in the lightning flash was a ghost that haunted the clean morning air, a reminder that their troubles were not so easily washed away. Abigail emerged from the barn, her face pale, but her expression composed. They did not speak of the intruder. There was nothing to say that they both did not already know. The threat was real, and it was close. As he climbed onto the wagon seat, she moved to walk alongside, her boots making soft, squelching sounds in the mud. He paused, gesturing with a tilt of his head to the empty space beside him. It was a silent offer, a small concession to their shared ordeal. She looked at the seat, then at the road ahead leading to Sweetwater, and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She understood, as he did, that arriving in town together, seated side by side, would be a statement they were not yet ready to make. It would be kindling for a fire they did not need. So she walked, and he drove, a careful, deliberate distance between the wagon wheel and her worn skirt, a moving tableau of their precarious situation. News in a town like Sweetwater travels faster than a prairie fire with a tailwind. The sight of Silas Ward's wagon entering town was common enough, but the sight of a young woman walking steadily beside it was a spectacle. As they moved down the main street, conversations on boardwalks dwindled to whispers. Doors that were open seemed to close. Faces appeared in windows. Curtains twitched. They were being watched, judged, their story already written and passed from tongue to tongue by the time they reached the general store. The working girl had spent the night at the recluse's ranch. The verdict was delivered by the town's self-appointed moral guardians. As Abigail stepped onto the boardwalk, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was permanently pinched in a state of disapproval, blocked her path. Behind her stood the Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was as thin as his hair. "Abigail, my dear child," the Reverend began, his voice oozing a sticky, false concern. "We were all so worried for you during that dreadful storm last night. Pray, tell us you found safe and proper shelter." The question was a trap, its jaws baited with public shame. Several other women had gathered, their expressions a mixture of feigned sympathy and hungry curiosity. Silas, who had been unhitching a can of milk, stopped, his body going rigid. He watched, his hand resting on the cold metal of the can, every muscle tense. Abigail did not falter. She met the Reverend's gaze with a calm that seemed to unnerve him. "I was perfectly safe, thank you, Reverend," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But where? Child, Mrs. Gable pressed, unable to contain her eagerness. "A young woman's reputation is such a delicate thing. For our own peace of mind, we must know you were protected." Abigail let the silence stretch for a moment, drawing the eyes of every loafer and shopper on the street. Even a few patrons from the saloon across the way had drifted to the doorway to watch the unfolding drama. When she finally spoke, her words were simple, delivered with a devastatingly straight face. "I slept with the cows, ma'am." A ripple of confusion went through the small crowd. "Mrs." Gable's mouth opened and closed like a beached fish. Abigail continued, her tone matter of fact. "The barn was dry and sturdy, and the cows are fine company. They are warmer than some people I know, and their judgments are far more honest." A great hoot of laughter erupted from the men gathered at the saloon's entrance. The sound was so sudden and genuine that it broke the spell of pious judgment. One of the women in Mrs. Gable's circle hid a smile behind her hand. The Reverend's face turned a blotchy red. Abigail had taken their weapon and disarmed it with a simple, absurd truth. Without another word, she nodded politely and stepped around the flustered group. Walking into the creamery? The small victory was short-lived. A little while later, as Silas was concluding his business, Mr. Klein, the president of the Sweetwater Bank, approached him. Mr. Klein was a man who dressed in Eastern suits that looked out of place in the dusty West, his face pale and perpetually serious. "Ward," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "A word, if you please." He led Silas to the side of the bank building, away from prying ears. "I have reviewed your account." Mr. Klein began, getting straight to the point. "Your loan payment is due at the end of the month. Given the inconsistent reports I have been hearing about the quality of your recent product, the board is feeling rather nervous. We will need the payment in full, on time. And if the quality standards are not met for this month's deliveries, we may have to reconsider the terms of your loan altogether." It was a threat wrapped in the polite language of finance. A foreclosure. Before Silas could even formulate a response, another voice, smooth as oiled leather, joined them, having a spot of trouble. Silas. Ephraim Cade had appeared as if from nowhere. A large, imposing man whose expensive hat and tailored coat could not hide the ruthless glint in his eyes. He placed a familiar hand on Mr. Klein's shoulder. Now. Philip, do not be so hard on the man. These are difficult times. He turned his full attention to Silas, his smile all teeth. I heard about the storm. A man alone has a hard time fighting a drought. Or other troubles. My offer still stands. You know, a fair price for your land. It would take this burden right off your shoulders. The collusion was blatant. A two-pronged attack from the forces of money and power. Silas felt the familiar, hot surge of anger, the old instinct to fight, but he held it in check. His face a mask of stone. The land is not for sale. Cade, he said, his voice flat and cold, as if on cue. Buck Tolliver swaggered over, a sneer on his face. He ignored Silas and Cade, his eyes locking onto Abigail as she exited the creamery. Well now, Tolliver said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. If it is not the little milkmaid. Heard you found a new place to sleep. Bet the old man's barn is not the only thing you are keeping warm out there. The insult was crude, designed to provoke, to strip Abigail of the dignity she had just won. Silas turned, and the change in him was terrifying. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. He did not raise his voice, did not move a muscle toward the revolver at his hip. He simply looked at Buck Tolliver, and his eyes, which were usually the color of a faded summer sky, became dark and hard as polished steel. The look was one of pure, controlled violence, a promise of swift and terrible retribution that was more menacing than any shouted threat. Tolliver, for all his bluster, took an involuntary step back, the sneer faltering on his lips. It was Mrs. Dobbs who broke the tense standoff. She appeared in the doorway of the creamery, her arms dusted with flour, her expression thunderous. That is enough out of you. Buck Tolliver, she boomed, her voice accustomed to commanding attention. And for your information, Mr. Klein, the milk from Half Moon Ranch has never been better. It is the richest cream I have seen all year, and my customers are already asking for more of the butter it produces. She glared at Cade. Some people in this town still value quality over gossip. From across the street, Deputy Hale, a young, earnest man who took his job seriously, straightened up from the post he had been leaning against. He had seen the whole exchange. He walked over, his thumbs hooked in his belt. Everything all right here? He asked, his gaze moving from Cade to Tolliver. He then looked at Silas. Mr. Ward, Mrs. Dobbs has already spoken to me about her concerns. If you believe someone is tampering with your property or your deliveries, you come and tell me. I will be keeping an eye on things. He gave Tolliver a long, hard look before nodding to the group and walking on. The alliance had been drawn. Cade's expression soured. He had shown his hand too early. With a curt nod, he and Tolliver moved off down the street. Mr. Klein, looking uncomfortable, simply cleared his throat and retreated into the sanctuary of his bank. On the long, quiet journey back to the ranch, Silas finally spoke, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I wanted to hurt him, he said, the words stark and unadorned, the way I used to, the way a soldier knows how. He flexed his hands on the leather reins. But that would not help you. It would only prove them right. It would make their lies look like the truth. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that some battles could not be won with a gun. Justice in this town, flawed as it was, required evidence and witnesses, not just righteous anger. Protecting Abigail meant protecting her name, and that required a kind of restraint he was only just beginning to learn. He looked over at her, walking so steadily in the dust beside the wagon. I will do this by the book, he promised, his voice low and fierce. I will follow their laws, and I will see you are not harmed by this. You will not pay the price for my trouble. Abigail looked up at him, her face smudged with dust, her expression serious. A small, sad smile touched her lips. The law's fine. Silas, she said, her voice soft but clear. "But the cows still need to be loved." The plan was born from a woman's logic, a kind of practicality that had been absent from Half Moon Ranch for 2 decades. It was Abigail who thought of the charcoal, the morning after their confrontation in town. She had taken a piece from the cold cook stove, ground it into a fine, black powder, and stored it in a small leather pouch. The idea was simple, almost elegant in its cunning. A man expecting to find only water and milk would not be looking for a trap made of dust. They brought Deputy Hale into the plan that same day, meeting him in a quiet corner behind the livery stable in Sweetwater. He listened intently, his young face serious, his brow furrowed in concentration. Silas, standing with his arms crossed, felt the old, familiar resistance to placing his fate in the hands of another man, especially one who wore a badge. He had learned in the war that the law was often just a matter of who had the most guns or the most money. But he looked at Abigail, at the quiet determination in her eyes, and knew he had to try her way. For her. "He will not try it on the main road into town," Hale reasoned, rubbing his chin. "Too much of a chance someone will come along. It will be at night, on your property, near that pond you mentioned." "There is a stand of cottonwoods about 100 yards from the pond," Silas said, the words coming out low and gravelly. "It offers a clear view. I can wait there." Hale shook his head. "No. Mr. Ward, if you are there, and something happens, Cade's lawyer will say it was a fight between 2 men, a squabble over land. They will make it your word against his. But if I am there, as an officer of the law, it is different. It becomes a crime against the whole county." The logic was sound, and Silas could not argue with it, so they agreed. That night, Abigail, with a delicate touch, dusted the fine charcoal powder around the inner rims and lids of the milk cans that sat on a small loading dock Silas had built. Silas, for his part, made a show of taking a longer, more difficult route back from his work on the far fence line, ensuring he would not be near the barn after dark. Then, as twilight bled into a moonless, star-dusted night, Deputy Hale slipped onto Half Moon Ranch, a ghost in the darkness, and settled himself into the deep shadows of the cottonwood grove to wait. The silence of the prairie at night was a living thing, a symphony of crickets, the rustle of unseen creatures in the dry grass, and the sigh of a wind that never truly died for Silas and Abigail. Waiting in the dim light of the cabin, the silence was a taut string, vibrating with suspense. They did not speak. He sat in his usual chair, cleaning his revolver with slow, methodical movements, the familiar ritual a comfort to his frayed nerves. She sat at the small table, mending a tear in one of her skirts, her stitches small and even, a counterpoint to the chaos they both felt brewing outside. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of a distant owl, made them both look up, their eyes meeting for a brief, questioning moment in the lamplight. It was well after midnight when the sound came, a soft, shuffling noise from the direction of the barn, followed by the faint, metallic scrape of a can lid being carefully, quietly pried open. Old Rook, sleeping at Silas's feet, lifted his head, a low growl starting deep in his chest. Silas placed a hand on his back, a silent command to be still. They both held their breath, listening. They heard the soft plop of a bucket being dipped into water, a sound they knew could only be coming from the stagnant pond. Then another and another. A few moments later, the metallic scrape came again as the lid was replaced. They waited. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, a sudden shout cut through the night. "Hold it right there! Tolliver!" The words were followed by the sound of a scuffle, a grunt of surprise, and then nothing. Silas was on his feet, his revolver in his hand, his body coiled and ready. Abigail stood up with him, her sewing forgotten in her lap. They moved to the door, peering into the darkness. A single lantern flared to life near the loading dock, illuminating two figures. Deputy Hale had Buck Tolliver by the scruff of his neck, one arm twisted firmly behind his back. In Tolliver's other hand was a bucket, still dripping with dark pond water. "Caught him in the act. Mr. Ward," Hale called out, his voice ringing with satisfaction. "And look at this." He forced Tolliver's hands into the lantern light. They were black, coated in the fine, damning powder of the charcoal. Cade did not wait for the sun to be fully up before he counterattacked. By mid-morning, he had ridden into Sweetwater with a slick, well-dressed lawyer from Cheyenne, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Buck Tolliver was released on a bond that Cade paid in cash, and the official narrative began to change. According to the lawyer, Mr. Tolliver was an innocent man who had simply stopped to water his horse at a public pond. He had noticed the milk cans were improperly sealed and, being a good neighbor, had attempted to secure them, getting some unfortunate soot on his hands in the process. But the real venom was reserved for Abigail, the lawyer. In a series of carefully orchestrated conversations in the saloon and the general store, began to paint a different picture. He spoke of a desperate young woman from the East, a girl who had inveigled her way onto the property of a lonely, vulnerable old man. He hinted at feminine wiles, at a calculated seduction designed to get her hands on a piece of land. He twisted her hard work into ambition, her honor into a performance. He was turning the victim into the villain, using the town's own prejudices as his weapon. The whispers that had followed Abigail now became a low, ugly murmur of accusation. Cade's true response came 2 nights later. It began as a low, distant rumble, a sound that Silas initially mistook for thunder from a storm that was not there, but the sound grew steadily. A deep, earth-shaking vibration that made the tin mugs on the cabin shelf rattle. He ran to the door, Abigail right behind him. In the pale moonlight, they saw it. A dark, moving river of horns and hides. A massive herd of longhorn cattle, pouring over the low ridge to the north and heading straight for their fence line. It was not a natural stampede. The animals were being driven, pushed from behind by unseen riders whose whoops and hollers were just barely audible over the thunder of 1,000 hooves. There was no time to think, only to act. "The cows!" Silas yelled, grabbing 2 storm lanterns from the porch. "We have to get them out of the barn before they panic and trample each other." They ran. The ground trembled beneath their feet. The air was thick with dust and the raw, animal smell of fear. Inside the barn, their small dairy herd was already in a state of terror, their eyes rolling, their bodies crashing against the wooden stalls. The noise of the approaching stampede was a physical force, a wall of sound that was driving them mad. The bell Abigail shouted, her voice thin against the roar. She pointed to the large cowbell Bessie wore. The sound, it will give them something to focus on. It was a brilliant, desperate idea. While Silas fought to open the main barn doors, Abigail unlatched the stalls, her voice a high, calming chant. Old Rook, his age forgotten in the surge of adrenaline, became a whirling dervish of instinct, nipping at heels, barking sharp commands, weaving through the panicked animals with the skill of a seasoned sheepdog. Silas grabbed a heavy bell from the tack room, ringing it with a steady, clanging rhythm. He and Abigail, lanterns held high, moved among their cows, their own bodies a fragile, human barrier against the overwhelming terror. They wrapped damp cloths from the water trough around the muzzles of the lid cows, a trick to calm them, and began the slow, perilous process of leading them out the back of the barn and toward the relative safety of an open pasture. The main body of the stampede hit the fence line with the force of a tidal wave. The wooden rails, which Silas had spent years mending, splintered and snapped like matchsticks. The river of cattle poured onto their land, a churning, unstoppable force of destruction. But their small herd was moving, a small island of relative calm in the midst of the maelstrom, guided by the light of the lanterns and the steady clang of the bell. They were almost clear when a large, wild-eyed steer, maddened by fear, broke away from the main herd and charged directly toward them. Silas shoved Abigail and the cow she was leading out of the way, putting himself in the path of the charging animal. He raised his lantern, hoping the light would turn it, but the beast was beyond reason. Its head went down, and in a blur of motion, it slammed into him, the impact lifting him off his feet and throwing him to the ground. The wind was knocked from his lungs. For a heart-stopping second, he lay there, stunned, the world a swirl of dust and spinning stars. He saw the churning hooves, a forest of sharp, deadly points, coming down all around him. He was in the path, about to be trampled, to be erased from the earth in a storm of his own worst nightmare. Then he felt hands on him, grabbing the collar of his shirt with a strength he would not have believed possible. It was Abigail. Her face was a pale mask of terror in the moonlight, her eyes wide with fierce determination. With a cry that was torn from the very depths of her soul, she dragged him, pulling him backward, scraping him over the rough ground, out from under the deadly rain of hooves. She fell on top of him, her body shielding his, as the last of the panicked animals thundered past. Her arms were wrapped around him in a desperate, life-saving embrace, her heart hammering against his back. Slowly, the noise receded, the thunder of hooves fading into the distance, leaving behind a ringing silence and the smell of dust and terror. The yard was a ruin of broken fences and trampled earth. A corner of the barn, where the steer had first struck, was a splintered wreck. They lay there for a long moment, tangled together on the ground, two exhausted survivors in the wreckage of the attack. They were battered, bruised, and covered in dirt, but they were alive. The shared terror, the fight for survival, had burned away the last of the distance between them, forging their separate struggles into a single, unbreakable bond. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his whole body aching. She rolled off him, sitting up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face in the pale light, checking for injury. A slow, shaky smile touched her lips, a flicker of light in the devastation. "See," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "an embrace can be useful, after all." Silas looked at her, at the dirt on her cheek and the fierce, unwavering loyalty in her eyes. He felt a crack in the old, frozen wall around his heart. A dry, rasping sound came from his throat, a sound he barely recognized as a chuckle. "Only," he said, his own voice rough with emotion, "when it is to save the cows and me." The saloon was not a house of justice, but on that day, it was made to serve as one. The long poker tables had been pushed against the walls, and the air, usually thick with the smell of whiskey and stale smoke, was heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies and nervous sweat. Judge Miller, a traveling magistrate who was more a horse trader than a jurist, sat at a makeshift bench constructed from 2 barrels and a plank of wood. He was the temporary law in Sweetwater, and the entire town had crowded into the saloon to act as its jury. They were ranchers, farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants, and nearly every man among them had, at one time or another, borrowed money from Mr. Klein's bank or sold cattle to Ephraim Cade. Their interests were not in abstract justice, but in their own survival, a fact that hung in the stifling air like a threat. The proceedings began with a simple, damning presentation of the facts. Deputy Hale was the first to speak, his voice clear and steady in the crowded room. He recounted the events of the stakeout, his words painting a vivid picture for the assembled townsfolk. He described waiting in the darkness of the cottonwoods, the sound of the crickets his only companion. He told of hearing the stealthy approach, of watching a figure he identified as Buck Tolliver creep toward the loading dock. He described the metallic scrape of the lid, the trips to the stagnant pond with a bucket, and the final, irrefutable evidence. "When I apprehended him," Hale concluded, his eyes fixed on the judge, his hands were covered in a fine black powder, and the bucket he held was full of dirty pond water. The powder matched the charcoal dust Miss Quinn had placed on the cans as a marker. He held up the small leather pouch of charcoal for all to see. It was a simple, tangible piece of the truth. Next came Mrs. Dobbs, her presence filling the space with an air of righteous indignation. She spoke of her long business relationship with Half Moon Ranch, of the dependable quality of Silas Ward's milk for nearly 2 decades. Then she described the recent decline, the thinness, the faint, sour smell that had begun to worry her. "It was not the smell of sick cows," she said, her voice booming. "I have been in this business for 30 years. I know that smell. This was different. It was the smell of dishonesty." She then described the remarkable turnaround in quality since Abigail had begun to work at the ranch. "The cream is back, thick and sweet as it ever was. That is not magic. Judge, that is the result of hard work and an honest hand. Something this town should value." The evidence was clear, the logic unassailable. But Ephraim Cade's lawyer, a man named Fitch from Cheyenne, was not interested in logic. He was a weaver of shadows, a man who knew that in a town ruled by prejudice, a whisper could be more powerful than a fact. When he rose to question Abigail, a predatory stillness fell over the room. He began with a tone of deep, fatherly concern, his voice smooth and persuasive. He asked her about her family, her father's illness, the poverty that had driven her from Boston. He painted a picture of a young woman in a desperate situation, his words dripping with a sympathy that felt more like an accusation. Then, he turned to the heart of his attack. "Miss Quinn," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "You are a young woman, new to the West, alone and without protection. Tell me, on the night of the recent storm, where did you take shelter?" "At Half Moon Ranch," Abigail answered, her voice quiet but firm. "Indeed," Fitch said, allowing the word to hang in the air. "And you spent the entire night there in the home of a man who, by his own reputation, has not kept the company of a woman for 20 years. The insinuation was as vile as it was obvious. A murmur went through the crowd. Silas, who had been sitting on a bench near the wall, felt a white-hot fury rise in him, so powerful it made his vision swim. He gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles turning white, forcing himself to remain still. "I slept in the barn, sir," Abigail said, her chin held high. "The barn," Fitch repeated, tasting the word. "Alone with only the animals for company. I was safe and I was dry. But you were not at your own home, under the protection of your family. You were on the property of a single man, a recluse, a soldier. Did it not occur to you, Miss Quinn, how such a situation might appear to the good, decent people of this town? Did it not occur to you that your reputation might be compromised?" He was not questioning her about the milk anymore. He was putting her character on trial, using her poverty and her gender as weapons against her. He was trying to make her seem like a schemer, a temptress who had used the storm as an excuse to entrap a lonely man. "My reputation," Abigail said, her voice trembling slightly but unbroken, "is based on my actions, not on the foul imaginings of others." "And what were your actions?" Fitch pressed, moving closer, to put yourself in a position that any father or husband in this room would find questionable. That was the final straw. Silas could not sit and listen to another word. He rose to his feet, the scrape of his chair on the rough floorboards loud as a gunshot. The entire room went silent, all eyes turning to him. He was a man who had not spoken in public for 2 decades, and his sudden movement commanded an absolute, stunned attention. He did not look at Fitch, or the judge, or the jury of watching faces. He looked directly at Abigail, and when he spoke, his voice was a low, rough thing, unused to carrying in a crowd, but it was filled with an unshakable conviction. "I invited her," he said. The words were simple, stark. The storm was on us. The road to town was a death trap. To send her out into it would have been a murder, so I told her to stay in the barn. He paused, letting his words sink in. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the years of his isolation being stripped away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. But he did not care. He had to tell the whole truth. For her. The barn door was propped open all night. He continued, his voice growing stronger. And I slept in the tack room, by the door. That is the truth of it. I offered her shelter because it was the right and decent thing to do. If there is any shame in that, then the shame belongs to this town, not to her. He had laid his own honor bare, his private code of conduct, his carefully guarded boundaries. All of it made public for her sake. He had admitted to his own limitations, his own fear of proximity, in order to prove her innocence. The silence that followed was different now. It was not the silence of suspicion, but of reassessment, of a new understanding dawning in the minds of his neighbors. Then a new voice broke the quiet. He is telling the truth. It was Martha, the wife of a rancher from the south side of the county, a sturdy, no-nonsense woman with hands as calloused as any man's. She stood up from her seat in the back, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. My husband and I have had hands get caught in blizzards, miles from any shelter, she said, her voice ringing with common sense. We have let them sleep in the barn, on the porch, anywhere they could be warm and safe. You do not leave a person to die in a storm because you are worried about what the gossips will say. That is not the way of the West. It is about keeping people alive. What Silas Ward did was not a scandal. It was an act of Christian decency. Her words were like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripple of agreement that spread through the room was palpable. Men who had been looking at Silas with suspicion now nodded in respect. Women who had been whispering about Abigail now looked at her with a new sympathy. Martha had given them a different lens through which to see the events, one of conscience rather than prejudice. The tide had turned. Judge Miller, who could read the mood of a room better than he could read a law book, saw it immediately. He banged his makeshift gavel on the plank. The evidence against Buck Tolliver is clear, he declared, his voice suddenly full of authority. The testimony regarding Miss Quinn's character is irrelevant to the matter at hand, which is the deliberate contamination of another man's property. He glared at Tolliver. You will pay a fine of $100 to the county, and you will pay Silas Ward for a full month's worth of milk, and you will spend the next 2 weeks repairing the public road. A gasp went through the room. It was a heavy sentence, a punishment that would be felt. Ephraim Cade stepped forward, a look of thunder on his face. He pulled a thick roll of bills from his coat and slapped the money down on the plank, paying Buck's fine without a word. He then turned to Silas, his eyes cold with a promise of future retribution. This is not over. Ward, he hissed, his voice a low threat that only Silas could hear. Then he and his lawyer and a sullen-looking Buck Tolliver pushed their way out of the saloon. The conflict was not resolved, merely postponed. But in that moment, it did not matter. As the crowd began to disperse, talking in low, excited tones, Silas and Abigail stood for a moment in the sudden quiet. The town had seen him, really seen him, for the first time in 20 years. They had not seen a myth or a ghost, but a man, flawed and wounded, who was willing to sacrifice his own cherished privacy for the honor of another. He turned to look at her, to see if she was all right. And in her eyes, he saw a look of such profound trust, such deep and unwavering loyalty, that it took his breath away. The town, the law, the threat from Cade, it all faded into the background. She looked at him not as a savior, and not as a recluse, but as the steady, unshakable center of her world. She looked at him with the kind of eyes that said, "Here is my home." The false peace that settled over Half Moon Ranch after the trial lasted less than a week. The victory in town had been one of words and laws, a fragile human construct. But nature, indifferent to the verdicts of men, was preparing a trial of its own. The heat that had been building for weeks became a physical presence, a weight on the shoulders, a shimmer in the air that distorted the distant mountains. The grass was cured to a crisp, honey-colored tinder, and the slightest spark could set the world ablaze. It came on a Tuesday night, during a dry thunderstorm that offered no rain, only a terrifying, percussive light show. Silas and Abigail stood on the porch, watching the silent, flickering veins of lightning spiderweb across the sky to the north, over Cade's vast property. Then, a single, brilliant bolt, thicker and brighter than the rest, plunged to the earth. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a faint, orange glow appeared on the horizon, a malevolent sunrise in the middle of the night. "Wildfire," Silas said, his voice flat and hard. The word was a sentence. For the first few hours, it seemed a distant threat, a spectacle of destruction that belonged to someone else. The wind was blowing from the south, pushing the fire away from them, driving it deeper into the uninhabited rangeland. But Silas, a man who had learned to read the wind as a sailor reads the sea, was not reassured. He watched the smoke plume, a towering, roiling pillar of black against the star-dusted sky. He saw the subtle shift in the tops of the cottonwood trees. "It is turning," he said, his voice a low growl of certainty. "The wind is turning." By the time the first hint of dawn stained the eastern sky, his words had proven true. The wind, fickle and treacherous, had swung around and was now blowing steadily from the northwest, driving the fire directly toward them. The distant glow had become a menacing, pulsing line of orange on the horizon, and the air was beginning to carry the sharp, acrid scent of burning pine. There was no panic. The soldier in Silas took command, his mind clear and sharp in the face of the enemy. "We will not be able to stop it," he said to Abigail, his voice a calm, authoritative command that she did not question. "We can only steer it. We will burn a line, a backfire. We need a firebreak." The work was brutal, a desperate race against a relentless clock. With shovels and axes, they began to clear a wide trench in the dry earth, 100 yards downwind from the barn and cabin. It was a scar on the land, a line drawn in the dirt, a fragile declaration of defiance. They moved the cows, their small, precious herd, to the open pasture on the far side of the creek bed, the one place that was mostly rock and sparse grass, a natural barrier against the flames. Old Rook, sensing the urgency, worked tirelessly, his bark sharp and authoritative as he helped guide the nervous animals. As the sun rose higher, the heat became a double torment, the scorching rays from above and the approaching furnace ahead. Thirst became a gnawing, constant companion. The creek, their primary source of water, was nothing more than a series of disconnected, muddy puddles. The cows, their tongues lolling, began to low with distress. It was Abigail who remembered a trick from her childhood in the damp, green hills of New England, a piece of knowledge so out of place in this arid landscape, it seemed like a dream. "The dew," she said, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "We can collect the morning dew." Silas looked at her as if she had lost her mind, but she was already pulling a large canvas tarp from the wagon. With his help, they stretched it between two low posts, creating a shallow basin in the middle. It was a desperate, improbable hope, but in the West, sometimes hope was all you had. By mid-afternoon, the fire was a monster. It was no longer a distant line on the horizon, but a roaring, living wall of flame, devouring the dry grass with a sound like a freight train, sending waves of searing heat that were almost unbearable even at a distance. They set their backfire, a controlled line of flame that ran along their trench, designed to burn up the fuel in the path of the main blaze. The two fires would meet, and with nothing left to consume, the main fire would, they prayed, be forced to turn. They stood in the relative safety of the rocky pasture with their herd, their faces black with soot, their lungs burning with every breath, and watched as their desperate strategy unfolded. It was in that moment, as they watched the two lines of fire converge in a furious, spectacular roar, that Abigail saw him. He was a small, stumbling figure on the ridge between the two fires. A man caught in a deadly trap of his own making, or the making of his master. It was Buck Tolliver. He was running, then falling, then crawling, his movements jerky and panicked. He was surrounded by a sea of flame, his escape cut off. "Silas, look!" she cried, her voice raw with horror. Silas saw him, and for a single, dark moment, he felt nothing. He saw not a man, but the instrument of his own torment. He saw the sneer, the insults, the sabotage, the stampede. He felt a cold, hard satisfaction that justice, in its most primal, fiery form, was about to be done. "He is getting what he deserves," Silas said, his voice a low, chilling rasp. "No," Abigail pleaded, grabbing his arm, her fingers digging into his soot-covered skin. "No man deserves that. He is a fool and a coward. But he is a man." She looked into his eyes, her own filled with a fierce, unwavering light. "Save him, Silas. Save him to save the human part of us." Her words cut through the haze of his anger and his grief. She was not just asking him to save his enemy. She was asking him to save himself from the cold, dead thing he had been for 20 years. She was asking him to choose mercy over vengeance, to choose life in all its messy, undeserving forms, over the sterile, righteous quiet of the grave. He looked at the fire, at the pathetic, trapped figure of the man who had tried to ruin him, and then he looked at her, and he made his choice. "Stay with the herd," he commanded, his voice once again that of a soldier. He grabbed a wet grain sack and a canteen of water. He plunged the sack into a puddle in the creek bed, then wrapped the sodden cloth around his head and face. Without another word, he ran, not away from the fire, but into the narrow, smoke-choked corridor between the two burning fronts. The heat was a physical blow, sucking the air from his lungs. The smoke was a blinding, choking fog. He ran with his head down, his eyes streaming, following the line of the ridge, guided by instinct and a lifetime of reading the land. He found Buck Tolliver collapsed on the ground, his clothes smoldering, his face a mask of terror and pain. He had tried to outrun the flames and had fallen, his leg twisted beneath him at an unnatural angle. Silas did not speak. He hoisted the man onto his broad shoulders, the dead weight of him a shocking burden. He turned and began the slow, torturous journey back, each step an agony of will. The smoke was thicker now, the roar of the fire a deafening, all-consuming presence. His lungs were on fire, his vision blurring. He stumbled, falling to one knee, the weight of his enemy pinning him down. For a moment, he thought he would not make it, that they would both be consumed. But then he saw her face in his mind, her eyes pleading with him to save the human part of themselves. With a great, guttural roar of effort, he pushed himself back to his feet and staggered on. He emerged from the smoke like a creature from a myth, a blackened, heaving figure carrying his fallen foe. He collapsed onto the ground in the rocky pasture, dropping Buck beside him, and lay there, gasping, his body racked with great, shuddering coughs. Abigail was there instantly, pressing the canteen to his lips, her hands cool on his feverish skin. Later, when the fire had passed, leaving behind a blackened, smoking landscape, they tended to Buck's injuries. His leg was broken, and he had burns on his hands and arms. As Abigail gently cleaned his wounds with water from the canteen, the man's bravado finally broke. Great. Racking sobs shook his body, tears carving clean paths through the soot on his cheeks. "He left me," he choked out, the words a torrent of guilt and betrayal. "Cade. He set the fire, used a lantern and some oil-soaked rags. Said it would finish you for good. He told me to drive some stray cattle toward the blaze to make it look like an accident. But the wind turned so fast, he just rode off. He left me to die." The confession, raw and unfiltered, hung in the smoky air. It was the final piece, the proof they needed. The next day, When Deputy Hale rode out to survey the damage, they told him everything. He listened, his young face hardening into a mask of grim resolve. He and 2 other men rode out to Cade's ranch and returned before evening, with Ephraim Cade tied to his own saddle, his face a picture of stunned disbelief. They stopped at the edge of what was left of Half Moon Ranch. Cade glared at Silas, his eyes burning with an impotent hatred. "You have not won. Ward," he spat. Silas looked at the man, at his expensive clothes and his soulless eyes, and he felt no triumph, no desire for revenge. He only felt a kind of weary pity. "You have already lost, Cade," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying on the still air. "You lost because you do not love anything but the land, and land cannot love you back." That night, after the deputy had taken Cade and a hobbling Buck Tolliver to the town jail, Silas and Abigail stood by the edge of the dry creek bed. The world was black and silent, the earth still warm beneath their feet. The smoke had cleared, and the stars were brilliant in the moonless sky. He looked at the scorched earth, at the ruins of his fence line, at the blackened scar that had once been his pasture. He should have felt a sense of loss, of defeat, but he did not. He felt clean, purged. He turned to her, her face a pale oval in the starlight. "When Sarah died," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel for 20 years. "I thought I buried my heart with her, right here in this valley. I thought it was gone forever." He paused, taking a ragged breath. Turns out, it was only sleeping. Abigail did not speak. She simply stepped closer to him and laid her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. He could feel the warmth of her palm through the thin fabric of his shirt. A steady, gentle pressure. He could feel his own heart, that old, sleeping muscle, begin to beat a little stronger, a little faster, under her hand. He looked down at her upturned face, at the unwavering trust in her eyes, and he did what he had been afraid to do for 2 decades. He leaned down and kissed her. It was a clumsy, hesitant kiss, tasting of smoke and ash and a profound, bone-deep weariness. His hands, when he raised them to cup her face, were trembling. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery, of a quiet, wondering recognition. It was a promise, not of a happy ending, but of a new beginning. She pulled back slightly, a small, gentle smile on her lips. She could feel the tremor in his hands, could see the fear and the hope warring in his eyes. "It is all right," she whispered, her voice a soothing balm on his raw nerves. "We will learn again, from the beginning." The day after Cade was taken away, the sky wept a soft, gray rain, as if trying to wash the memory of the fire from the blackened earth. The rain hissed on the cooling embers and turned the soot into a thin, black paste. Silas and Abigail stood in the ruins of their world, the scent of wet ash, a funereal incense in the air. The devastation was absolute. Fences were gone. A large section of the barn was a skeleton of charred timbers, and the pasture was a monochrome wasteland. It was a sight that could have broken a lesser man. But for Silas, it was simply the next battleground. He had survived worse. He expected to face it alone, with her by his side. That had become his new definition of the world, but he was wrong. They came on the 3rd day, under a clear, washed sky. The first was the blacksmith, Abigail's father, looking frail but determined, riding in a neighbor's wagon with a toolbox at his feet. He could not lift or swing a hammer for long, but he could sharpen a saw and measure a joist with an expert's eye. Then came Deputy Hale, his badge off, his sleeves rolled up, with 2 other men from town, Mrs. Dobbs arrived in her buggy, not with tools, but with 2 large baskets filled with fresh bread, smoked ham, and a wheel of her sharpest cheese. By midday, the trickle had become a stream. Men who had once whispered about Silas behind their hands now worked alongside him. their sweat and grunts a new kind of conversation. They raised new posts from timber Silas had cut and seasoned years ago, their hammers ringing out a rhythm of reconstruction. The women of the town, who had once eyed Abigail with suspicion, set up a makeshift kitchen near the cabin, keeping a large pot of coffee hot and laying out the food. They spoke to Abigail with a newfound respect, asking about her family, about her life in the East. Their earlier prejudices burned away in the fire that had almost destroyed her. Silas moved through it all in a sort of daze. For 20 years, he had kept these people at arm's length, and now they were here, in the heart of his sanctuary, rebuilding it with their own hands. He found it difficult to speak, to offer the right words of thanks. But when the blacksmith's wife, a small, tired woman with Abigail's kind eyes, pressed a plate of food into his hands and said, "You kept our girls safe. Mr. Ward, it is the least we can do," he understood. This was not charity. It was an exchange. It was the currency of community, a language he was only just beginning to relearn. Abigail's family became a regular presence at the ranch. Her younger brothers, awed by the wide-open space and the quiet gravity of Silas, would help with small tasks, their boyish energy a strange and wonderful new sound on the quiet land. Her father would sit on the porch, offering quiet advice on the angle of a roof beam or the proper way to set a post. One afternoon, Abigail's mother found Silas by the creek, where he was clearing away the fire-damaged brush. She stood for a moment, her hands twisting in her apron, before the words came out in a quiet rush. "When we came out here," she said, her eyes welling with tears, "I was so afraid. It is a hard land for a family with nothing. I was afraid of what might happen to Abigail, of the choices she might be forced to make." She looked at him, her gaze direct and full of a mother's fierce gratitude. "You have been a good and honorable man to her, Silas Ward. You gave her a chance, but you also gave her your protection. A mother does not forget that." She reached out and, for a second, touched his arm. "Thank you." He could only nod, his throat thick with an emotion he could not name. He was not used to being seen as a protector. He had failed to protect Sarah. But here, now, he had somehow, in his clumsy, silent way, succeeded. As the barn rose from its ashes, stronger and better than before, so did the rhythm of their life together. The work was no longer a solitary struggle for him and a desperate job for her. It was a shared purpose, a daily act of love. He found himself talking to the cows again, but his voice was different. The harsh, commanding tone of a soldier was gone, replaced by a low, gentle rumble. He learned their moods, the twitch of an ear that meant a fly was bothering them, the soft low that meant they were content. Abigail, in turn, took over the ledgers, her neat, precise handwriting a stark contrast to his own rough scrawl. She tracked every penny, every ounce of milk, her sharp mind seeing patterns and opportunities he had never considered. Their production soared, and Mrs. Dobbs, delighted, offered them a new, long-term contract at a better price. One evening, long after Abigail had returned to town, Silas found himself standing by the forge. He lit the fire, the familiar roar and the blossoming heat a comfort to him. He was not a blacksmith, not like Abigail's father, but he was a soldier and a rancher, and he knew his way around iron. He took a single, thick horseshoe nail, a nail he had saved because it was perfectly made, and heated it in the glowing coals. When it was white hot, he began to work. The process was slow and deliberate. He was not making a tool or a weapon. He was making a promise. The ring of the hammer on the anvil was a new kind of vow. With each blow, he shaped the rough iron, bending it, smoothing it, turning a thing of utility into a thing of beauty. He worked for hours, his face streaked with soot, his mind focused on this one. Small, perfect circle. When the shape was right, he let it cool before carefully, painstakingly, engraving a tiny, perfect crescent moon on its surface, the mark of Half Moon Ranch. a symbol of two halves, waiting to be made whole. He chose a night a week later. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in hues of rose and violet. The new barn stood strong and proud, smelling of fresh-cut pine and whitewash. They were sitting on the porch steps, the day's work done, a comfortable silence between them. He had the small, iron ring in a tiny wooden box he had carved, and it felt as heavy as a cannonball in his pocket. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet evening. He had rehearsed 100 speeches in his mind, full of words he had read in books, words of poetry and passion. But when he looked at her tired, beautiful face, at the quiet strength in her eyes, all those fancy words evaporated, leaving only the simple, unadorned truth. He turned to her, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His voice was rough, and the words came out clumsy, but they were the most honest words he had ever spoken. "Abigail," he began, "this ranch, it is a hard place, and I am not an easy man." He looked down at his own calloused hands. "But if you were willing, I was thinking we could milk this herd together, until we are old." She stared at him, her eyes wide. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile of such pure, unadulterated joy that it lit up the twilight. Then a laugh bubbled up from her, a real, genuine laugh at the simple, rustic absurdity of his proposal, milking a herd together. It was not a promise of riches or an easy life, but of a shared struggle, of a partnership forged in mud and milk and hardship. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Tears welled in her eyes, sparkling in the last rays of the sun, and she nodded, unable to speak. "Yes, Silas," she finally whispered. "Yes." He fumbled in his pocket, his hands trembling, and pulled out the small wooden box. As he opened it, old Rook, who had been sleeping at their feet, suddenly woke up and let out a sharp, excited bark, his tail thumping against the porch. The sudden noise startled Silas, and the box flew from his clumsy fingers, the small iron ring tumbling out and landing in the dust at their feet. For a moment, they both stared at it. Then they both laughed, a shared, helpless sound of joy and mild exasperation. They bent down at the same time to pick it up, their heads bumping gently, their hands meeting over the small, dark circle in the dust. The simple, shared act of bending together felt more like a vow than any formal ceremony. The town, when it heard the news, reacted with a surprising, wholehearted approval. The whispers of gossip were replaced by offers of help for the wedding. Even Reverend Miller, when they met him on the street, offered a genuine, unforced smile. "You both kept your boundaries with honor," he said, his voice free of its usual piety. "And from that, you have built the foundations of a good home. God bless you both." That night, alone in the quiet of his cabin, Silas took something from the small wooden chest where he kept his few precious mementos. It was a faded blue scarf with a pattern of tiny white flowers, the one Sarah had been wearing the day of the stampede. He had kept it all these years, a tangible piece of his grief. He walked to the small mantelpiece over the cold fireplace. A few days earlier, Abigail had placed a small, simple wreath there that she had woven from wildflowers and sweetgrass. He held the old scarf in his hands for a long time, the fabric soft and worn. He was not saying goodbye. He was not letting go. He was making peace. He carefully, gently, draped the blue scarf over a peg on the wall, right beside the new wreath. The two objects, one a symbol of a love that was lost, the other a symbol of a love that was found, hung there together, not as rivals, but as two parts of the same long, difficult, and beautiful story. He reached out and touched the soft fabric of the scarf, his calloused fingers tracing the pattern of the flowers. He looked at the wreath, its colors vibrant with life, and he whispered into the quiet of the room, to the ghost that had haunted him for 20 years, the ghost he was finally setting free. "Thank you, "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was not grief, but gratitude. "Thank you for bringing her to me." The wedding was not held in a church. Its sanctuary was the newly rebuilt barnyard, its steeple the wide Wyoming sky. The scent of fresh-cut pine from the new barn walls mingled with the sweet smell of hay and the rich, loamy scent of the rain-washed earth. The townspeople came, not in their Sunday finest, but in their clean work clothes, their faces scrubbed, their hands still showing the calluses from the work they had shared. They were not guests. They were fellow builders, shareholders in the joy of this day. The dairy cows, their coats brushed to a glossy sheen, stood placidly in the nearby pasture, their bells tinkling softly on the breeze, a gentle, pastoral music. Reverend Miller performed the ceremony, his words stripped of their usual fire and brimstone, simple and heartfelt, as if he too had been changed by the events of the past weeks. Silas stood tall, his old cavalry coat brushed and mended, the iron ring he had forged feeling rough and unfamiliar in his pocket. Abigail wore a simple blue dress, the color of a summer sky, that her mother had lovingly stitched from saved cloth. She held a small bouquet of prairie wildflowers, their vibrant, tenacious beauty, a reflection of her own spirit. When Silas slipped the horseshoe nail ring onto her finger, it was not a symbol of delicate, ornamental love. It was a circle of iron, forged in fire, practical and unbreakable. It was a promise to be a partner in labor, a shield against hardship, a thing made not for show, but for permanence. It was a love that was meant to last. There was no champagne for the toast. Instead, Silas and Abigail filled tin mugs from a pail of the morning's sweetest, richest milk, and the whole town raised their own cups to join them. The taste was cool and clean, the very essence of the life they had fought so hard to protect. Later, as the afternoon sun slanted low, one of the ranchers brought out his fiddle, and the slow, mournful, yet hopeful notes of Shenandoah drifted across the valley. It was a song of farewells and long journeys, of rivers and of coming home. It was the perfect anthem for them all. In that moment, watching the community he had once shunned celebrate the love he had once believed was lost to him forever, Silas understood the true nature of his long solitude. It had been a fortress built to protect him from the pain of a single, devastating moment. But in doing so, it had turned his entire life into a barren desert. He had thought he was defending a memory, but he had only been starving his own heart. Abigail had not just walked onto his land. She had walked into his desert and shown him how to find water again. Healing did not come from building higher walls, but from having the courage to open a gate. He saw the proof of it all around him. The law had been served, but it was not the law that had saved them. It was the courage of a few good people misses. Dobbs's staunch defense, Deputy Hale's quiet diligence, Martha's common-sense testimony. The law needed evidence, but a community, a true community, needed a heart, and their collective heart, though scarred and cautious, had proven to be a powerful thing. He even saw it in the town's newest, most unlikely resident, Buck Tolliver, his leg still in a splint, had been sentenced to 6 months of hard labor, working to rebuild the public fences his stampede had destroyed. But he worked without complaint, his old sneer gone, replaced by the quiet, humbled look of a man who had stared into the face of his own death and been pulled back by the very man he had tried to ruin. He was repaying his debt not just to the law, but to Silas, in the only way he knew how. The town itself was healing. The ugly whispers about honor had been replaced by a grudging respect. They had learned a hard lesson that a person's worth was not measured by their poverty, and that honor was not a whip to be used against those who had the least. Even their relationship with the land was changing. The fire had been a terrible teacher, but its lessons were being learned. Silas and Abigail, with help from their neighbors, had spent days reinforcing the banks of the creek bed with stone, ensuring it would hold water longer after the rains. And near the cabin, they had dug a deep cistern lined with clay, with the canvas tarp stretched over it at night, a testament to Abigail's quiet ingenuity and their shared commitment to surviving and thriving in this harsh and beautiful place. The new fence that now enclosed Half Moon Ranch was a symbol of this new understanding. Its posts were straight and strong, its wire taut. It was a boundary. Yes, but its purpose was no longer to isolate. It was to protect what they were now building together, a shared space of work and love. And hanging from a peg on the porch of the cabin, scrubbed clean and gleaming in the sun, was the old zinc bucket Abigail had carried on that first day. It was not just a tool anymore. It was a talisman, a reminder that sometimes the greatest changes begin with the simplest, most audacious request. A month after the wedding, the mail rider brought a letter with a Boston postmark. Abigail opened it, a puzzled look on her face that slowly turned to one of astonishment. It was from her former employer, a wealthy merchant who owned a large and successful creamery back east. He had heard, through a roundabout series of letters, of her new life and the remarkable quality of the milk she and Silas were producing. The letter was a proposal. He wanted to form a partnership, to provide the capital to build a modern, large-scale creamery right in Sweetwater. He saw an opportunity, a chance to bring Eastern efficiency to the untapped bounty of the West. The offer was a thunderbolt, a choice they had never imagined. It was a path to a kind of prosperity and influence they had never sought. They could expand, hire dozens of hands, become the biggest dairy operation in the territory. The idea was dizzying, a future of wealth and security laid at their feet. They spoke of it that night on the porch, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Silas listened to her read the letter again, his mind grappling with the vision of a future so different from the one he had just begun to embrace. He thought of the noise, the complications, the ledgers and the shipping schedules. "It is a great opportunity," Abigail said, her voice quiet and thoughtful. "We could build something truly grand. We would never have to worry about the bank again." "No," Silas agreed, his voice a low rumble. "We would not." He looked out at the dark silhouette of the new barn, at the faint, glowing windows of the town in the far distance. He thought of the women in that town, of Mrs. Gable and the others, and of the desperation that drove them to wield gossip like a weapon. He thought of Abigail's own mother, her face etched with a weariness that came from a lifetime of hard choices and too few options. "What if," he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke, "we did not build a grand creamery in Sweetwater? What if we built a small one, right here at Half Moon?" Abigail looked at him, her eyes questioning in the starlight. "Not for us," he continued, finding his way through the thought. "Not to be the biggest, but to be a beginning. A place where the women of this town could work. A place where a young woman with a sick father would not have to walk 12 miles and risk her good name for the chance to earn a decent wage. We could give them a foothold, a point of leverage." A slow, beautiful smile spread across Abigail's face. It was not the smile of a businesswoman seizing an opportunity, but the smile of a woman seeing a dream she did not even know she had come true. She had come here seeking survival, and now he was offering her the chance to build a sanctuary. She folded the letter and put it aside. The choice had been made. Later, before they turned in for the night, he poured 2 glasses of milk, the white liquid cool and luminous in the lamplight. He handed one to her and raised his own, the scarred, calloused hand that had held a revolver for so long now holding a simple glass. He touched his glass gently to hers, the soft clink a quiet promise in the vast silence of the prairie. 20 years ago," he said, his voice thick with the weight of all that had passed, "I held a gun. Tonight, I hold your hand." Outside, the herd settled for the night, the soft sound of their breathing a gentle rhythm under the stars. A breeze rustled the new, green shoots of grass that were already beginning to push through the blackened earth, carrying the clean, hopeful scent of life, beginning again. The West was still a hard and unforgiving land, but inside the small log cabin of Half Moon Ranch, a lamp was lit against the darkness, and its light was warm and steady. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment below and let us know where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.